Hello friends and welcome to tonight's edition of Bedtime Story for Grown-Ups. Tonight I shall be reading for you a short story by Sherwood Anderson entitled The Return. If you enjoy these stories, I would encourage you to subscribe so you will be notified when a new bedtime story is ready for you. And so, find a place where you can relax. Once you have settled in, take a deep breath. Your day has come to an end. There's nothing left for you to do today but listen to the story and fall asleep. And so, let us begin. The Return by Sherwood Anderson. 18 years. Well, he was driving a good car, an expensive roadster. He was well clad. A rather solid, fine-looking man, not too heavy. When he had left the Middle Western town to go live in New York City, he was 22, and now, on his way back there, he was 40. He drove toward the town from the east, stopping for lunch at another town 10 miles away. When he went away from Caxton, after his mother died, he used to write letters to friends at home. But after several months, the replies began to come with less and less frequency. On the day when he sat eating his lunch at a small hotel in the town 10 miles east of Caxton, he suddenly thought of the reason and was ashamed. Am I going back there on this visit for the same reason I wrote the letters? He asked himself. For a moment he thought he might not go on. There was still time to turn back. Outside, in the principal business street of the town, people were walking about. The sun shone warmly. Although he had lived for so many years in New York, he had always kept, buried away in him somewhere, a hankering for his own country. All the day before, he had been driving through the eastern Ohio country, crossing many small streams, running down through small valleys, seeing the white farmhouses set back from the road, and the big red barns. The elders were still in bloom along the fences. Boys were swimming in a creek. The wheat had been cut, and now the corn was shoulder high. Everywhere the drone of bees. In patches of woodland along the road, a heavy, mysterious silence. Now, however, he began thinking of something else. Shame crept over him. When I first left Caxton, I wrote letters back to my boyhood friends there, but I wrote always about myself. When I had written a letter telling what I was doing in the city, what friends I was making, what my prospects were, I put, at every end of the letter, perhaps a little inquiry. I hope you are well. How are things going with you? Something of that sort. The returning native, his name was John Holden, had grown very uneasy. After 18 years, it seemed to him he could see, lying before him, one of the letters written 18 years before, when he had first come into the strange eastern city. His mother's brother, a successful architect in the city, had given him such an opportunity. He had been at the theater to see Mansfield as Brutus. He had taken the night boat upriver to Albany with his aunt. There were 2 very handsome girls on the boat. Everything then must have been in the same tone. His uncle had given him a rare opportunity, and he had taken advantage of it. In time, he had also become a successful architect. In New York City, there were certain great buildings, 2 or 3 skyscrapers, several huge industrial plants, and number of handsome and expensive residences, that were the products of his brain. When it came down to the scratch, John Holden had to admit that his uncle had not been excessively fond of him. It had just happened that his aunt and uncle had no children of their own. He did his work in the office well and carefully, had developed a certain rather striking knack for design. The aunt had liked him better. She had always tried to think of him as her own son, and treated him as a son. Sometimes she called him son. Once or twice, after his uncle died, he had a notion. His aunt was a good woman, but sometimes he thought she would rather have enjoyed having him, John Holden, go in a bit more for wickedness, go a little on the loose, now and then. He never did anything she had to forgive him for. Perhaps she hungered for the opportunity to forgive. Odd thoughts, eh? Well, what was a fellow to do? One had but one life to live. One had to think of oneself. Botheration. John Holden had rather counted on the trip back to Caxton, had really counted on it more than he realized. It was a bright summer day. He had been driving for days over the mountains of Pennsylvania, through New York State, through eastern Ohio. Gertrude, his wife, had died during the summer before, and his one son, a lad of 12, had gone away for the summer to a boys' camp in Vermont. The idea had just come to him. I'll drive the car along slowly through the country, drinking it in. In need of a rest, time to think. What I really need is to renew old acquaintances. I'll go back to Caxton and stay several days. I'll see Herman and Frank and Joe. Then I'll go call on Lillian and Kate. What a lot of fun, really. It might just be that when he got to Caxton, the Caxton ball team would be playing a game. Say, with a team from Yarrington. Lillian might go to the game with him. It was in his mind faintly that Lillian had never married. How did he know that? He had heard nothing from Caxton for many years. The ball game would be in Heffler's Field, and he and Lillian would go out there, walking under the maple trees along Turner Street, past the old stave factory, then in the dust of the road, past where the sawmill used to stand, and on into the field itself. He would be carrying a sunshade over Lillian's head, and Bob French would be standing at the gate where you went into the field and charging the people 25 cents to see the game. Well, it would not be Bob, his son, perhaps. There would be something very nice in the notion of Lillian's going off to the ball game that way with an old sweetheart. A crowd of boys, women and men, going through a cattle gate into Heffler's Field. Tramping through the dust, young men with their sweethearts, a few gray-haired women, mothers of boys who belonged to the team. Lillian and he sitting in the rickety grandstand in the hot sun. Once it had been, how they had felt, he and Lillian, sitting there together. It had been rather hard to keep the attention centered on the players in the field. One couldn't ask a neighbor, who's ahead now, Caxton or Yarrington? Lillian's hand lay in her lap. What white, delicate, expressive hands they were. Once. That was just before he went away to live in the city with his uncle, and but a month after his mother died. He and Lillian went to the ball field together at night. His father had died when he was a young lad, and he had no relatives left in the town. Going off to the ball field at night was maybe a risky thing for Lillian to do. Risky for her reputation, if anyone found it out. But she had seemed willing enough. You know how small-town girls of that age are. Her father owned a retail shoe store in Caxton and was a good, respectable man. But the Holdens, John's father, had been a lawyer. After they got back from the ball field that night, it must have been after midnight, they went to sit on the front porch before her father's house. He must have known. A daughter cavorting about half the night with a young man that way. They had clung to each other with a sort of queer, desperate feeling neither understood. She did not go into the house until after 3 o'clock, and went then only because he insisted. He hadn't wanted to ruin her reputation. Why, he might have. She was like a little frightened child at the thought of his going away. He was 22 then, and she was 18. 18 and 22 are 40. John Holden was 40 on the day when he sat at lunch at the hotel in the town 10 miles from Caxton. Now, he thought, he might be able to walk through the streets of Caxton to the ballpark with Lillian with a certain effect. You know how it is. One has to accept the fact that youth is gone. If there should turn out to be such a ball game and Lillian would go with him, and he would leave the car in the garage and ask her to walk. One saw pictures of that sort of thing in the movies. A man coming back to his native village after 20 years. A new beauty taking the place of the beauty of youth. Something like that. In the spring, the leaves on maple trees are lovely, but they are even more lovely in the fall. A flame of color, manhood and womanhood. After he had finished his lunch, John did not feel very comfortable. The road to Caxton. It used to take nearly 3 hours to travel the distance with a horse and buggy. And without any effort, the distance could be made in 20 minutes. He lit a cigar and went for a walk, not in the streets of Caxton, but in the streets of the town 10 miles away. If he got to Caxton in the evening, just at dusk, say now. With an inward pang, John realized that he wanted darkness. The kindliness of soft evening lights. Lillian, Joe, Herman, and the rest. It had been 18 years for the others as well as for himself. Now he had succeeded, a little, in twisting his fear of Caxton into fear for the others, and it made him feel somewhat better. But at once he realized what he was doing, and again felt uncomfortable. One had to look out for changes, new people, new buildings, middle-aged people grown old. Youth grown middle-aged. At any rate, he was thinking of the other now. He wasn't, as when he wrote letters home 18 years before, thinking only of himself. Am I? It was a question. An absurd situation, really. He had sailed along so gaily through upper New York State, through western Pennsylvania, through eastern Ohio. Men were at work in the fields and in the towns. Farmers drove into towns in their cars. Clouds of dust arose on some distant road, seen across a valley. Once he had stopped his car near a bridge and gone for a walk along the banks of a creek, where it wound through a wood. He was liking people. Well, he had never before given much time to people, to thinking of them and their affairs. I hadn't time, he told himself. He had always realized that, while he was a good enough architect, things move fast in America. New men were coming on. He couldn't take chances of going on forever on his uncle's reputation. A man had to be always on the alert. Fortunately, his marriage had been a help. It had made valuable connections for him. Twice he had picked up people on the road. There was a lad of 16 from some town of eastern Pennsylvania, working his way westward toward the Pacific coast by picking up rides in cars. A summer's adventure. John had carried him all of one day, and had listened to his talk with keen pleasure. And so this was the younger generation. The boy had nice eyes, and an eager, friendly manner. He smoked cigarettes, and once, when they had a puncture, he was very quick and eager about changing the tire. "Now, you don't soil your hands, mister. I can do it like a flash," he said, and he did. The boy said he intended working his way overland to the Pacific coast, where he would try to get a job of some kind on an ocean freighter, and that, if he did, he would go on around the world. "But do you speak any foreign languages?" The boy did not. Across John Holden's mind flashed pictures of hot eastern deserts, crowded Asiatic towns, wild, half-savage mountain countries. As a young architect, and before his uncle died, he had spent 2 years in foreign travel, studying building in many countries. But he said nothing of this thought to the boy. Vast plans entered into with eager boyish abandon, a world tour undertaken as he, when a young man, might have undertaken to find his way from his uncle's house in East 81st Street downtown to the Battery. How do I know? Perhaps he will do it, John thought. The day in company with the boy had been very pleasant, and he had been on the alert to pick him up again the next morning. But the boy had gone on his way, had caught a ride with some early riser. Why hadn't John invited him to his hotel for the night? The notion hadn't come to him until too late. Youth, rather wild and undisciplined, running wild, eh? I wonder why I never did it. Never wanted to do it. If he had been a bit wilder, more reckless. That night, that time when he and Lillian. It's all right being reckless with yourself, but when someone else is involved, a young girl in a small town, you yourself lighting out. He remembered sharply that on the night, long before, as he sat with Lillian on the porch before her father's house, his hand. It had seemed as though Lillian on that evening might not have objected to anything he wanted to do. He had thought of the consequences. Women must be protected by men, all that sort of thing. Lillian had seemed rather stunned when he walked away, even though it was 3 o'clock in the morning. She had been rather like a person waiting at a railroad station for the coming of a train. There is a blackboard, and a strange man comes out and writes on it. Train number 287 has been discontinued. Something like that. Well, it had been all right. Everything had been all right. Later, 4 years later, he had married a New York woman of good family. Even in a city like New York, where there are so many people, her family had been well known. They had connections. After marriage, sometimes, it is true, he had wondered. Gertrude used to look at him sometimes with an odd light in her eyes. That boy he picked up in the road. Once during the day, when he said something to the boy, the same queer look came into his eyes. It would be rather upsetting if one knew that the boy had purposely avoided him next morning. There had been Gertrude's cousin. Once after his marriage, John heard a rumor that Gertrude had wanted to marry that cousin. But of course he had said nothing to her. Why should he have? She was his wife. There had been, he had heard, a good deal of family objection to the cousin. He was reputed to be wild, a gambler, and drinker. Once the cousin had come to the Holden apartment at 2 in the morning, drunk and demanding that he would be allowed to see Gertrude, and she slipped on a dressing gown and went down to him. That was in the hallway of the apartment downstairs, where almost anyone might have come in and seen her. As a matter of fact, the elevator boy and the janitor did see her. She had stood in the hallway below, talking for nearly an hour. What about? He had never asked Gertrude directly, and she had never told him anything. When she came upstairs again and had got into her bed, he lay in his own bed trembling, but remained silent. He had been afraid that if he spoke, he might say something rude. Better keep still. The cousin had disappeared. John had a suspicion that Gertrude later supplied him with money. He went out west, somewhere. Now Gertrude was dead. She had always seemed very well, but suddenly she was attacked by a baffling kind of slow fever that lasted nearly a year. Sometimes she seemed about to get better, and then suddenly the fever grew worse. It might be that she did not want to live. What a notion! John had been at the bedside with the doctor when she died. It was at night, and as the boy was asleep, he was not called. There was something of the same feeling he had had that night of his youth when he went with Lillian to the ball field. An odd sense of futility, of inadequacy. There was no doubt that in some subtle way both women had accused him. Of what? There had always been, in some vague, indefinable way, a kind of accusation in the attitude toward him of his uncle, the architect, and of his aunt. They had left him their money, but it was as though the uncle had said, as though Lillian during that night, long ago, had said. Had they all said the same thing, and was Gertrude, his wife, saying it as she lay dying? A smile. You have always taken such good care of yourself, haven't you, John dear? You have observed the rules. You have taken no chances for yourself or the others. She had actually said something of that sort to him once, in a moment of anger. In a small town, 10 miles from Caxton, there wasn't any park to which a man could go to sit. If one stayed about the hotel, someone from Caxton might come in. "Hello, what are you doing here?" It would be inconvenient to explain. "I didn't want to go to Caxton in the daylight. I want the kindliness of evening light for myself and the people I may see there." John Holden's boy, he was but 12. One might say his character had not begun to form yet. One felt in him sometimes a sort of unconscious and casual selfishness, an unawareness of others, a rather unhealthy sharpness about getting the best of others. It was a thing that should be corrected in him, and at once. John Holden had got himself into a small panic. I must write him a letter at once. Such a habit gets fixed in a boy, and then in the man, and it cannot later be shaken off. There are such a lot of people living in the world. Every man and woman has his own point of view. To be civilized, really, is to be aware of the others, their hopes, their gladness, their disillusionments in life. John Holden was now walking along a residence street of a small Ohio town, composing in fancy a letter to his son in the boys' camp up in Vermont. He was a man who wrote to his son every day. "I think a man should," he told himself. "One should remember that now the boy has no mother." He had come to an outlying railroad station. It was neat, with grass and flowers growing in a round bed in the very center of a lawn. Some man, the station agent and telegraph operator perhaps, passed him and went inside the station. John followed him in. On the wall of the waiting room there was a framed copy of the timetable, and he stood studying it. A train went to Caxton at 5. Another train came from Caxton and passed through the town he was now in at 7:43. The 7:19 out of Caxton. The man in the small business section of the station opened the sliding panel and looked at him. The two men just stared at each other without speaking, and then the panel was slid shut again. John looked at his watch. 2:28. At about 6 he could drive over to Caxton and dine at a hotel there. After he had dined, it would be evening, and people would be coming into the main street. The 7:19 would come in. When John was a lad, sometimes he, Joe, Herman, and often several other lads climbed on the front of the baggage or mail car and stole a ride to the very town he was now in. What a thrill! Crouched down in the gathering darkness on the platform as the train ran the 10 miles, the car rocking from side to side. When it got a little dark, in the fall or spring, the fields beside the track were lighted up when the fireman opened his firebox to throw in coal. Once John saw a rabbit running along in the glare of the light beside the track. He could have reached down and caught it with his hand. In the neighboring town the boys went into saloons and played pool and drank beer. They could depend upon catching a ride back home on the local freight that got to Caxton at about 10:30. On one of the adventures, John and Herman got drunk, and Joe had to help them into an empty coal car and later get them out at Caxton. Herman got sick, and when they were getting off the freight at Caxton, he stumbled and came very near falling under the wheels of the moving train. John wasn't as drunk as Herman. When the others weren't looking, he had poured several of the glasses of beer into a spittoon. In Caxton, he and Joe had to walk about with Herman for several hours, and when John finally got home, his mother was still awake and was worried. He had to lie to her. "I drove out into the country with Herman, and the wheel broke. We had to walk home." The reason Joe could carry his beer so well was because he was German. His father owned the town meat market, and the family had beer on the table at home. No wonder it did not knock him out as it did Herman and John. There was a bench at the side of the railroad station in the shade, and John sat there for a long time. 2 hours, 3 hours. Why hadn't he brought a book? In fancy he composed a letter to his son, and in it he spoke of the fields lying beside the road outside the town of Caxton, of his greeting old friends there, of things that had happened when he was a boy. He even spoke of his former sweetheart, of Lillian. If he now thought out just what he was going to say in the letter, he could write it in his room at the hotel over in Caxton, in a few minutes without having to stop and think what he was going to say. You can't always be too fussy about what you say to a young boy. Really, sometimes you should take him into your confidence, into your life. Make him a part of your life. It was 6:20 when John drove into Caxton and went to the hotel, where he registered and was shown to a room on the street As he drove into town, he saw Billy Baker, who, when he was a young man, had a paralyzed leg that dragged along the sidewalk when he walked. Now he was getting old. His face seemed wrinkled and faded, like a dried lemon, and his clothes had spots down the front. People, even sick people, live a long time in small Ohio towns. It is surprising how they hang on. John had put his car, of a rather expensive make, into a garage beside the hotel. Formerly, in his day, the building had been used as a livery barn. There used to be pictures of famous trotting and pacing horses on the walls of the little office at the front. Old Davy Gray, who owned racehorses of his own, ran the livery barn then, and John occasionally hired a rig there. He hired a rig and took Lillian for a ride into the country, along moonlit roads. By a lonely farmhouse a dog barked. Sometimes they drove along a little dirt road lined with elders and stopped their horse. How still everything was. What a queer feeling they had. They couldn't talk. Sometimes they sat in silence, thus, very near each other, for a long, long time. Once they got out of the buggy, having tied the horse to the fence, and walked in a newly cut hayfield. The cut hay lay all about in little cocks. John wanted to lie on one of the haycocks with Lillian, but did not dare to suggest it. At the hotel, John ate his dinner in silence. There wasn't even a traveling salesman in the dining room, and presently the proprietor's wife came and stood by his table to talk with him. They had a good many tourists, but this just happened to be a quiet day. Dull days came that way in the hotel business. The woman's husband was a traveling man and had bought a hotel to give his wife something to keep her interest, while he was on the road. He was away from home so much. They had come to Caxton from Pittsburgh. After he had dined, John went up to his room, and presently the woman followed. The door leading into the hall had been left open, and she came and stood in the doorway. Really, she was rather handsome. She only wanted to be sure that everything was all right, that he had towels and soap, and everything he needed. For a time she lingered by the door, talking of the town. "It's a good little town. General Hurst is buried here. You should drive out to the cemetery and see the statue." He wondered who General Hurst was. In what war had he fought? Odd that he hadn't remembered about him. The town had a piano factory, and there was a watch company from Cincinnati, talking of putting up a plant. They figured there is less chance of labor trouble in a small town like this. The woman went, going reluctantly. As she was going along the hallway, she stopped once and looked back. There was something a little queer. They were both self-conscious. "I hope you'll be comfortable," she said. At 40, a man did not come home to his own hometown to start. A traveling man's wife, eh? Well, well. At 7:45, John went out for a walk on Main Street, and almost at once he met Tom Ballard, who at once recognized him, a fact that pleased Tom. He bragged about it. "Once I see a face, I never forget. Well, well." When John was 22, Tom must have been about 15. His father was the leading doctor of the town. He took John in tow, walked back with him toward the hotel. He kept exclaiming, "I knew you at once. You haven't changed much, really." Tom was in his turn a doctor, and there was about him something. Right away, John guessed what it was. They went up into John's room, and John, having in his bag a bottle of whiskey, poured Tom a drink, which he took somewhat too eagerly, John thought. There was talk. After Tom had taken the drink, he sat on the edge of the bed, still holding the bottle John had passed to him. Herman was running a dray now. He had married Kit Small and had 5 kids. Joe was working for the International Harvester Company. I don't know whether he's in town now or not. He's a troubleshooter, a swell mechanic, a good fellow, said Tom. They drank again. As for Lillian, mentioned with an air of being casual by John, he, Tom, knew of course that she had been married and divorced. There was some sort of trouble about another man. Her husband married again later, and now she lived with her mother, her father, the shoe merchant, having died. Tom spoke somewhat guardedly, as though protecting a friend. I guess he's all right now. Going straight and all. Good thing she never had any kids. She's a little nervous and queer, has lost her looks a good deal. The 2 men went downstairs, and, walking along Main Street, got into a car belonging to the doctor. I'll take you for a little ride, Tom said, but as he was about to pull away from the curb where the car had been parked, he turned and smiled at his passenger. We ought to celebrate a little, account of your coming back here, he said. What do you say to a quart? John handed him a $10 bill, and he disappeared into a nearby drugstore. When he came back, he laughed. I used your name all right. They didn't recognize it. In the prescription I wrote you, I say you had a general breakdown, that you needed to be built up. I recommended that you take a teaspoon 3 times a day. Lord, my prescription book is getting almost empty. The drugstore belonged to a man named Will Bennett. You remember him, maybe? He's Ed Bennett's son, married Carrie Wyatt. The names were but dim things in John's mind. This man is going to get drunk. He's going to try to get me drunk, too, he thought. When they had turned out of Main Street and into Walnut Street, they stopped midway between 2 streetlights and had another drink. John holding the bottle to his lips, but putting his tongue over the opening. He remembered the evenings with Joe and Herman, when he had secretly poured his beer into a spittoon. He felt cold and lonely. Walnut Street was one along which he used to walk, coming home late at night from Lillian's house. He remembered people who then lived along the street, and a list of names began running through his head. Often the names remained, but did not call up images of people. They were just names. He hoped that the doctor would not turn the car into the street in which the Holdens had lived. Lillian had lived over in another part of town, in what was called the Red House District. Just why it had been called that, John did not know. They drove silently along, up a small hill, and came to the edge of town, going south. Stopping before a house that had evidently been built since John's time, Tom sounded his horn. Didn't the fairground used to stand about here? John asked. The doctor turned and nodded his head. Yes, just here, he said. He kept on sounding his horn, and the man and woman came out of the house and stood in the road beside the car. Let's get Maud and Alf and all go over to Lilesey's Point, Tom said. He had indeed taken John into tow. For a time, John wondered if he was to be introduced. We got some hooch. Meet John Holden, used to live here years ago. At the fairground when John was a lad. Dave Gray, the livery man, used to work out his racehorses in the early morning. Herman, who was a horse enthusiast, who then dreamed of someday becoming a horseman, came often to John's house in the early morning, and the two boys went off to the fairground without breakfast. Herman had got some sandwiches made of sliced bread and cold meat out of his mother's pantry. They went cross lots and climbing fences and eating the sandwiches. In a meadow they had to cross there was heavy dew on the grass, and the meadow larks flew up before them. Herman had at least come somewhere in his life his youthful passion. He still lived about horses. He owned a dray. With a little inward qualm, John wondered. Perhaps Herman ran a motor truck. The man and the woman got into the car, the woman on the back seat with John, the husband in front with Tom. And they drove away to another house. John could not keep track of the streets they passed through. Occasionally he asked the woman, "What street are we in now?" They were joined by Maud and Alf, who also crowded into the back seat. Maud was a slender woman of 28 or 30, with yellow hair and blue eyes, and at once she seemed determined to make up to John. "I don't take more than an inch of room," she said, laughing and squeezing herself in between John and the first woman, whose name he could not later remember. He rather liked Maud. When the car had been driven some 18 miles along a gravel road, they came to Lilesey's farmhouse, which had been converted into a roadhouse, and got out. Maud had been silent most of the way, but she sat very close to John, and as he felt cold and lonely, he was grateful for the warmth and her slender body. Occasionally she spoke to him in a half-whisper. "Ain't the night swell? Gee, I like it out in the dark this way." Lilesey's Point was at a bend of the Samson River, a small stream to which John as a lad had occasionally gone on fishing excursions with his father. Later he went out there several times with crowds of young fellows and their girls. They drove out then in Gray's old bus, and the trip out and back took several hours. On the way home at night they had great fun singing at the top of their voices and waking sleeping farmers along the road. Occasionally some of the party got out and walked for a ways. It was a chance for a fellow to kiss a girl when the others could not see. By hurrying a little, they could later easily catch up with the bus. A rather heavy-faced Italian named Francisco owned Lilesey's, and it had a dance hall and a dining room. Drinks could be had if you knew the roads, and it was evident the doctor and his friends were old acquaintances. At once they declared John should not buy anything, the declaration, in fact, being made before he had offered. "You're our guest now, don't you forget that. When we come sometimes to your town, then it will be all right," Tom said. He laughed. "And that makes me think I forgot your change," he said, handing John a $5 bill. The whiskey got at the drugstore had been consumed on the way out, all except John and Maud drinking heartily. "I don't like the stuff, do you, Mr. Holden?" Maud said, and giggled. Twice during the trip out, her fingers had crept over and touched lightly his fingers, and each time she had apologized. "Oh, do excuse me," she said. John felt a little as he had felt earlier in the evening, when the woman of the hotel had come to stand at the door of his room, and had seemed reluctant about going away. After they got out of the car at Lilesey's, he felt uncomfortably old and queer. "What am I doing here with these people?" he kept asking himself. When they had got into the light, he stole a look at his watch. It was not yet 9 o'clock. Several other cars, most of them, the doctor explained, from Yarrington, stood before the door, and when they had taken several drinks of rather mild Italian red wine, all of the party, except Maud and John, went into the dance hall to dance. The doctor took John aside and whispered to him. "Lay off Maud," he said. He explained hurriedly that Ulf and Maud had been having a row, and that for several days they had not spoken to each other, although they lived in the same house, ate at the same table, and slept in the same bed. "He thinks she gets too gay with men," Tom explained. "You better look out a little." The woman and man sat on a bench under a tree on the lawn before the house, and when the others had danced, they came out, bringing more drinks. Tom had got some more whiskey. "It's moon, but pretty good stuff," he declared. In the clear sky overhead, stars were shining, and when the others were dancing, John turned his head and saw across the road and between the trees that lined its banks the stars reflected in the water of the Samson. A light from the house fell on Maud's face, a rather strikingly lovely face in that light, but when looked at closely, rather petulant. A good deal of the spoiled child in her, John thought. She began asking him about life in the city of New York. "I was there once, but for only 3 days. It was when I went to school in the East. A girl I knew lived there. She married a lawyer named Trigan, or something like that. You didn't know him, I guess." And now there was a hungry, dissatisfied look on her face. "God, I'd like to live in a place like that. Not in this hole. There hadn't no man better tempt me." When she said that, she giggled again. Once during the evening they walked across the dusty road and stood for a time by the river's edge, but got back to the bench before the others had finished their dance. Maud persistently refused to dance. At 10:30, all of the others having got a little drunk, they drove back to town. Maud again sitting beside John. On the drive, Ulf went to sleep. Maud pressed her slender body against John's, and after 2 or 3 futile moves, to which he made no special response, she boldly put a hand into his. The second woman and her husband talked with Tom of people they had seen at Lilesey's. "Do you think there's anything up between Fanny and Joe?" "No, I think she's on the square." They got to Joe's hotel at 11:30, and bidding them all good night, he went upstairs. Ulf had awakened. When they were parting, he leaned out of the car and looked closely at John. "What did he say your name was?" he asked. John went up a dark staircase and sat on the bed in his room. Lillian had lost her looks. She had married, and her husband had divorced her. Joe was a troubleshooter. He worked for an international harvester company, a swell mechanic. Herman was a drayman. He had 5 kids. 3 men in a room next John's were playing poker. They laughed and talked, and their voices came clearly to John. "You think so, do you? Well, I'll prove you're wrong." A mild quarrel began. As it was summer, the windows of John's room were open, and he went to one to stand, looking out. A moon had come up, and he could see down into an alleyway. 2 men came out of a street and stood in the alleyway, whispering. After they left, 2 cats crept along a roof and began a love-making scene. The game in the next room broke up. John could hear voices in the hallway. "Now, forget it. I tell you, you're both wrong." John thought of his son at the camp up in Vermont. "I haven't written him a letter today." He felt guilty. Opening his bag, he took out paper and sat down to write. But after 2 or 3 attempts, gave it up and put the paper away again. How fine the night had been, as he sat on the bench beside the woman at Lalsey's. Now the woman was in bed with her husband. They were not speaking to each other. Could I do it? John asked himself, and then, for the first time that evening, a smile came to his lips. Why not? He asked himself. With his bag in his hand, he went down the dark hallway and into the hotel office and began pounding on a desk. A fat old man with thin red hair and sleep-heavy eyes appeared from somewhere. John explained. I can't sleep. I think I'll drive on. I want to get to Pittsburgh, and as I can't sleep, I might as well be driving. He paid his bill. Then he asked the clerk to go and arouse the man in the garage and give him an extra $1. If I need gas, is there any place open? He asked. But evidently the man did not hear. Perhaps he thought the question absurd. He stood in the moonlight on the sidewalk before the door of the hotel and heard the clerk pounding on a door. Presently voices were heard, and the headlights of his car shone. The car appeared, driven by a boy. He seemed very alive and alert. I saw you out at Lalsey's, he said, and without being asked, went to look at the tank. You're all right, you got most 8 gallons, he assured John as he climbed into the driver's seat. How friendly the car, how friendly the night. John was not one who enjoyed fast driving, but he went out of the town at very high speed. You go down 2 blocks, turn to your right, and go 3. There you hit the cement. Go right straight to the east. You can't miss it. John was taking the turns at racing speed. At the edge of town, someone shouted to him from the darkness, but he did not stop. He hungered to get into the road going east. I'll let her out, he thought. Lord, it will be fun. I'll let her out.